Hi, I'm Linda from Sewn Fabrics. I want to show you how to make a dress just like this one. So first up, we're going to want a few measurements. We're going to make this dress in two parts. There's going to be a dress shape and then there's going to be a sleeve shape. So for the dress shape, you're going to want to know from around armpit level, slightly higher, whatever height you want your dress to come up to. You're going to need to know from there down to your waist, and then you're going to need to know from your waist to whatever length you want your skirt to be. So the height of your dress piece is going to be those two combined, plus a hem at the top, plus a hem at the bottom. To do the width for the bodice, you're going to want to know the widest part that your bodice is going around, and then you're going to make the bodice part twice that width. Then you're going to curve out and make the bottom of the skirt 1.5 times whatever your bodice part is. For the strap, you're just going to want to know from front to back, so where it comes up to the dress, and then you're going to want to double that for the length and for the width, whatever width you want your strap to be, plus enough for a hem at each side. To spread the flare of the skirt out more evenly, we're going to divide the dress into 5 separate pieces, all of them the same. We're just going to cut it 5 times. So where you took your width, you're going to divide that, so you only want 1/5 of that measurement, so that was twice around the bust. Now you want 1/5 of that as the width of your pattern. The height obviously will stay exactly the same, we're just making it a lot wider so that when you shirr it, it's going to add that lovely flare that kicks out. It's up to you whether you choose to add a side seam allowance to your dress piece. If you choose to add one, you'll have a little bit more movement. If you choose not to, then it's going to hold a little bit tighter. For your straps, you're going to want to cut 2 of them. Although we're going to hem the top and bottom as well, you're going to want a slightly tighter fit with your shirring, so there's no seam allowance needed for those, just for the side seams. So in total, you're going to want somewhere between 2.5 to 3 meters of cotton fabric, and the fabric that I've been using has been quilting weight. So to start off constructing the dress, we're going to put 2 pieces so that they're patterned side together, lined up, and we're going to sew all the way down the side. We're going to repeat that so that we're sewing another piece down to the other side until you've got a loop with all 5 pieces joined together. So pick whatever seam allowance you chose when you were cutting out, and then you're just going to sew down the side. So now you've sewn all your side seams, you should have something that looks like a big giant loop that is far bigger than you'll ever fit into. That's how it should be looking. Now what we're going to do is to finish off the seams. Because we're using cotton, cotton tends to unravel, so we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So I'm going to use an overcast foot and I'm going to zigzag over the edge of the fabric. If you haven't got an overcast foot, you can just do a zigzag right near the edge, or obviously if you've got an overlocker, then you're more than welcome to use that. So we're just going to have a go at sealing in these edges so that they're not fraying. And then just repeat on the others. Now you've done your side seams, we want to sew across the top. So you take your narrow end of your tube and then you're just going to turn it and then turn it again. If you're a little bit nervous about doing this sort of thing, then you're more than welcome to either iron it or pin it so it stays in place. I just tend to wing it a little bit. So we're just going to pop it underneath here. Bring your needle down to make sure that you're near the edge. Then we're just going to sew our top hem. Okay, finally we've got to the end. What we're going to do is use shirring to gather up the whole of the bodice. Now the quality and thickness of your elastic thread will have some influence on what your gathering is like, but on the whole it tends to shrink to half the size. Most sewing machines prefer to have the elastic thread hand wound around the bobbin and to wind it around so that you have no real tension to it. However, there are always exceptions to the rule. There are a few sewing machines that do prefer to have their bobbins wound under tension, either be that by hand or slowly on the machine. So because every sewing machine acts slightly differently with tensioning, you will want to have a little play just with a bit of scrap fabric and see what works best for you. Now I have a front loading bobbin, so when I'm putting my bobbin in, I'm going to want to do it exactly the same as the way that I'd put any normal bobbin in. Now if you have a top loading bobbin, what you might find is that normally where you get away with not putting your thread through the tensioning loop because it automatically will pull it up through, it won't always do that with elastic thread. So you might have to be a little bit more careful as to how you're threading with a top loading bobbin. The other thing to bear in mind is that you might need to adjust your bobbin tension. So on my front loading one I have a tiny screw here. On the top loading types you might have to take your machine apart a little bit more to do it. You'll know if you need to change your bobbin tension because as you're sewing you'll find that the elastic thread starts forming a bit of a zigzag across the top. You won't have a nice smooth straight line. So if when you're sewing it doesn't look like it's really gathering up much and not shirring up to a smaller amount, and when you turn it over it's got a zigzag, then that's a screw that you want to adjust ever so slightly. So again, do slight adjustments and have a go and stitch out and see how it comes out, because you'll find that a small turn on bobbin tension goes a long way. So I'm just going to bring my elastic thread up as per normal by bringing my needle down and then scooping it up. Now what you might find is if you have a top loading machine, you may need to leave the needle plate area in front of while you're bringing it up because it might affect the position that the elastic thread gets pushed into. You'll find you get a tighter gather if you set your stitch length longer. So on my machine I tend to set it somewhere between 3 and 4. The longer you do it, the more space it's got for the elastic to be able to gather up. Now when you're sewing, if you've done your little test strip, if the thread looks like it's just looping around the elastic and not really holding it down firmly tight to your fabric, you'll need to adjust your tension a little bit. So my machine prefers my tension turning up to 4. So you might need to adjust it or you might need to leave it depending on what it's like. So if it's not gathering and it's looking like it's loose elastic at the back, it's the bobbin tension. If it looks like it's loose thread at the back, it's the thread tension that you need to change instead. And then lastly, the other thing that I tend to change on my sewing machine to make it easier to do shirring is to swap my sewing machine feet. My preference is for a stitch guide foot. Now the way I use this foot is, as you can see, it has lots of markings along the front. I line these markings up with the elastic, and so instead of having to spend ages drawing lots of rows in chalk or in fabric marker pens, I can just use these marks on here to be able to line my previous row up with and to be able to sew perfect lines each time. Now because there's lots of little markings, I find I go a little bit cross-eyed if I'm trying to concentrate on which one I'm doing. So I use a tiny bit of lipstick, mark the one that I want, then I can wipe it off again at the end, and then that way I know just to look for the red spot and to line it up with that. So at the moment it doesn't look like there's a great deal of difference between the bodice and then the dress part of the skirt. So when you're shirring, this is going to get even more difficult to look for. What we're going to do to make it easier is we're just going to mark the point where the dress starts to kink out. So as you can see, it goes straight down to here and then it starts to flare out from that point. So we're just going to pop a clip on here just to show you where it is. Now I prefer to use clips just because when you're doing rows and rows of shirring and it's going to take an awful lot of fabric to get round, the last thing you want is to be jabbed by 100 pins on your way through. So clips tend to make it much easier. Hair clips, if you haven't got any quilting clips, will also do. When you're coming to do the next ones, just make sure that you're lining them up and that you're getting the same point on each seam, and just mark all 5 like that. You want your first line of shirring to line up, so you're effectively stitching in the ditch, stitching over the line that you did
for your hem. Make sure that it's patterned side up because you want your elastic to end up underneath and hidden. So don't try and be tempted to sew things the other way up. So we're just going to sew as per normal, but with the adjusted settings on the sewing machine. Now you can see already there's a slight gather happening behind. Don't be too worried if it isn't a big gather. Don't be too worried if your stitching doesn't sit directly over the previous layer. If you're slightly wiggly, nobody's going to notice. Apart from you. Now when you get back round to the seam that you started on, simply stitch a little bit, reverse a little bit, and then you're just going to lift it and move it along so that that stitch here lines up with your little red dot. I tend to prefer to bring my needle down manually to make sure that it sits in that seam so that you won't notice that little tail of the thread that's going to come down and follow along the seam. It's going to do that all the way down the entire side of your bodice. So you don't need to snip in between, you just need to line it up with that little part of the seam. So again, you're going to do a couple of stitches, reversing back and forward just to secure that elastic in place, and then off you go again, this time trying to keep this red dot lined up roughly with where these are. So we're just skipping forwards to the end of the second row because otherwise it will be quite boring to watch. Again, backwards, forwards, backwards, and then skip, line it up with your red dot, place it down, manually bring the needle down to try and get it so it lines up in that seam, forwards and backwards, and then off you go again. And you're just going to keep doing a few of those, and I'll just show you a few different points so you can see how well it gathers. I'm just coming up to my marker now, so a couple of hours later. The back should be looking something like this. So you should have nice even lines, your elastic should be looking straight, your thread should be sitting nice and close so the elastic shouldn't be gapping away, and it should be gathering really nicely. I've just got to move it one more line, so I'm going to take out my marker clip, and then I know when I've finished this last line, then that's my bodice done. If when you get to the point where your bodice is done but it's not quite crinkling up as much as mine, what you might want to do is turn it this way up, hold a steam iron just lightly over the top, so not actually pressing down on it, just hovering over, let the steam go over it, and that will help to shrink it up a little bit further. So we're just going to sew the last little bit now. The bodice is finished. You can see now that there's a big difference between the bodice part and the skirt part. You can see there's a lovely stretch on the bodice, so that's going to fit really nicely without any zippers or buttons or closures of any kind. You might want to try it on at this point, make sure that you're definitely happy with the length before you hem it. So we're going to sew the bottom of the dress now, the hem at the bottom. Before we do that, make sure that you've adjusted your sewing machine settings back to what they were before, especially if you've adjusted your bobbin tension, otherwise you'll wonder what's going on. You want to do a very narrow hem, so I only fold to about here and round again. If you try doing a hem that's an awful lot wider than that, what will happen is that because you've used a diagonal shape for your skirt at the base, it means that this long edge right at the end is going to be slightly longer than the edge for where you're folding up to. And so what that means for you is as you get round, you're going to find that it wants to twist on itself like that, and that's not going to look as neat. So just make sure that you've got quite a narrow hem, and then you're good to go. So it should look something like this when you're sewing. And then just keep on going until you reach all the way around. I won't bore you with making you watch the rest. Once you've finished, your hem should look like this, going all the way around the bottom. And then as we're in the mood for hemming, we're going to do the straps next. What you're going to do is to sew a hem around every single side, so all the way down the long sides and also along the short sides as well. So we'll have a look at that as soon as that's done. And once you've finished your hems, this is what your fabric should now be looking like. So there should be nice, neat, narrow hems going all the way down the sides, all the way down the ends. Don't worry too much if you haven't got your corners too straight, too far on, because they're not going to be seen anyway. So don't get yourself concerned if that's happened. I've got the elastic bobbin back into the bobbin case. Don't forget to adjust your thread tension and stitch length and bobbin tension if you need to. We're just going to follow the same line of stitching down on the outside as we did when we started off the top of the dress, and then we're going to turn when we get to the end, so I'll quickly show you how to do that. If we stop the thread and work our way back and cut the thread, you're far more likely to end up with the elastic popping loose somewhere and your strap failing effectively. So what we're going to do is we're just going to turn it and go back round the other way. Now, I haven't used the stitch guide foot because the direction of fabric is going to keep changing, so sometimes your shirring is going to be on the left, sometimes it's going to be on the right, so it's not going to be as effective. Now what we're going to do is to lift the needle up, and then we're just going to eyeball it so that it's roughly across here. Obviously, if you want to have it exact, then feel free to mark your fabric. I'm just going to line it up roughly with just outside of that foot. So you should be noticing once you're a few lines in, it's already shrinking in size and already gathering up really nicely. So just keep on going. Once you start getting near the end, just be aware that once you're spacing your last couple of rows that you need to make them even, because the last thing you want is to space this one close and then have a big gap before you come up to do the opposite side, so that you're matching your stitching from the hem. So just make sure that if I'm looking at this, I'm going to want 2 lines in between just to split that evenly so that you haven't got one big gather coming up on the bottom part. Once you've finished all your shirring, your 2 straps should look something like this. What I'd do next is try on your dress and have a look at whereabouts you want your straps to sit. What I would recommend is, because you've got 5 panels for your dress, is you make sure that you have 1 panel sitting centrally at the front so that you don't have a seam that looks off centre, because that won't look quite right when you try it on after. I'm sure if you wanted to, you could machine sew the strap onto the bodice, but I prefer to hand sew it. The reason I prefer to hand sew it is that once you've sewn across here, it tends to flap up, and that's going to look a little bit scruffy. It's going to push it out at the front. Also, by hand sewing it, you can make sure that you're leaving these ruffles so that it looks in keeping with the rest of the bodice. You can also give it a little bit more give so that you're going to still keep a little bit more of your stretch. So the way that I tend to hand sew it on is just to tie my little knot here to start me off. And then I'm just going to stitch down just below where I've got the top hem, just above where I've got this top hem. So I'm going to do a longer stitch on the back, a shorter stitch coming through to the front, so there isn't much stitch showing, but it's still got quite a long stitch length overall. So we're just going to sew across here. So you can see now that if I left it as just stitching across there, this bit tends to stick up and that's going to fold up and it's going to look a little bit scruffy. So what we're going to do is just to stitch up to here. And then we're going to fix it down around the edges all the way back and through. And then we're just going to sew a knot at the end just to hold it all together. And you can see how that's now sitting much nicer and neater. There's no bits that are sticking up around the outside, so that's going to sit a lot flatter. And if we look inside, you've maintained your ruffle at the front, so it's still going to be in keeping with the rest of the bodice. And all you need to do now is just to finish off doing the other three, and it's ready to wear.
And here it is, all finished. So if you enjoyed that, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and we'll bring you more sewing tutorials soon. Don't forget you can also visit us at www.sewingbeefabrics.co.uk if you want to see more tutorials, our fabrics, haberdashery, sewing machine feet and all sorts of other sewing and embroidery accessories.